Welcome. I'd like to welcome everybody who's come today for this pretty exciting dialogue on clinical research across the color line. This is a topic of tremendous and growing importance, and it's talked about far too little. So I am very excited that we have the symposium here today, and we have Brodies and non-Brodies turning out to be part of this conversation for multiple reasons. Number one, we are, of course, deeply committed to diversity and inclusion, and that is, of course, in our workplace, but more broadly in the science we do. And it's a commitment that is very, very wide-ranging to the patients and the clinical community with whom we work. So I want to express my enormous gratitude to the two partner groups that brought this together here at the Broad. The Metastatic Breast Cancer Project, whose mission has been to engage patients with metastatic breast cancer of all races and all ethnicities as true partners in clinical research, not as subjects of clinical research, but as partners in clinical research. And I think the Metastatic Breast Cancer Project has been just pioneering new ways to do that are possible now together with the web and with national IRBs. And it's a very exciting project. There'll be more discussion about that. But the minute the goal is to engage patients across the United States, then the question of are we really engaging patients equitably across all different groups comes to the fore. And if you just take a first cut at that, the answer is no. There are a lot of reasons why you don't engage equitably and equally across all of these groups. And so you got to think hard about it and how to do it. The other group that co-sponsored this is Shades at Broad, which is a recently formed affinity group here at the Broad, whose mission is to support people of color at the Broad and in the large Broad community and foster a deeper understanding amongst Brodies about racial and ethnic differences. And I'm really thrilled that Shades at Broad has formed, and the Broad Institute is extremely supportive of this new affinity group here. So thank you to these two groups for co-sponsoring and bringing together this conversation today. Now, why is this important beyond our general commitment to diversity and inclusion? It's important for a number of reasons. Number one, over the coming decades, a lot of progress in medicine is going to have to come from learning from the clinical experience of people. We had a lot of decades where molecular biology could learn from the experience of bacteria and fruit flies and mice and human cells. And the truth is, some of the best medical research occurred by engaging model organisms and cells in the laboratory. We then have had extensive progress through specific focused studies where you recruit patients into one hospital and collect samples and do things, and yeah, also incredibly powerful. But the future is going to have to involve engaging patients throughout the entire clinical enterprise. Why? Because there are an awful lot of things we cannot learn in the small sample of an individual clinical trial or a small clinical study. There are a lot of things we can't learn because they're too small, because they're not representative of the kinds of conditions that folks encounter, and because there are too many hypotheses to test. As more and more cancer drugs come along, doing all those combinations in registered clinical trials is simply not going to be feasible. We're going to learn from patients' experiences. So for all these reasons, it's very important, and the Broad scientists, I think, have understood that we need to think about working at the cutting edge of the clinical experience and the engagement of patients. That means patients must be partners in that research, because patients are the only ones who actually control their medical records, can say, I want to be part of that. Everything else is a workaround from engaging the right person. Once you say that, you realize that this question of diversity is not a side point. It is a central point of the population of the United States. 40% of the population of the United States qualifies as a racial or ethnic minority. It will soon be the case that that will be the majority of the United States will qualify as a minority. And it would be crazy not to engage the majority of the United States in clinical research, because we fail to understand that the groups to which people belong and affiliate react differently to clinical research and understand clinical research in different ways, and have different concerns about trust and different histories with their engagement with the medical system. And if we don't understand those things, well, then we're going to be doing a terrible job of engaging today 40%, tomorrow 50%, and beyond that of the United States. So the point is, this is not discretionary. This is central to the progress of medicine, that we learn how to do this and learn how to engage all populations. There's mighty good reasons why there are differences in how people view participating in the clinical research experience and view partnership. And it obviously traces back to many historical facts about the fact that it hasn't always been partnership. It has been sometimes exploitation at the worst. It has been certainly lack of trust and engagement in the middle of that. There are big costs to past errors, and we need to understand them and acknowledge them. And the way you build trust is you start by understanding and you commit to transparency. It also matters because medicine it's not identical in all groups. Yeah, we're all one human species, that's absolutely right. But of course, different groups have some genetic variations that may affect their risk of getting a particular type of cancer. They may have different diets on average that may affect their risks. They may have other different exposures. And recognizing that we're one human species, but there's heterogeneity in genetics across the population, environment across the population, exposures, it's important because we're going to learn things by studying different groups. And I can give you just really great examples. We know, for example, that the risk of prostate cancer is considerably higher amongst African Americans than European Americans. Well, that's really significant. There are even now genetic studies, some of which have come out of the Broad, that suggest some of the genetic reasons that might contribute to that. Not that it's all necessarily genetic, but that there are some genetic variations at a higher frequency in one group and another group that could explain those things. They're important. We know that with regard to diabetes, a wonderful study that emerged here at the Broad some years ago showed that despite a very large study in European Americans of the genetic risk factors for diabetes, at least one whopping big risk factor was totally missed, but was found in Latinos, because in the Latino population, there's a genetic variation in a gene called SLC16A11 that's at much higher frequency in Latinos and at a tiny frequency in Europe, and you'd never see it in Europe. And yet it's a really important transporter, and it's teaching us a lot about the disease. So we can't actually do the science right without engaging different groups throughout the population and having that trust. So it's central to core values. It's central to how we're going to go forward to do biomedical research in the future. It is central because the science we're going to learn is going to be much better by engaging. This is not, all of these pieces come together. And as I say, it's central because being able to engage with minority groups, racial, ethnic, is going to be the majority of the United States population. So I can't think of anything more important than getting this right. And it's hard because of history. So I don't know if I've left anything out, but it seems like this is a well-justified topic. And like many things the Broad takes on, we try to distill it to the essence and ask, what really needs to be done to make this work. And in this case, there are even particular projects we're engaging in now where it will be at the cutting edge of it by asking ourselves, are we succeeding in engaging? And so that will be important. So So I want to thank all of you for bringing your knowledge, your understanding, and your commitment to this. And I want to pass off, I'm even shockingly on time here, to the first real speaker of the symposium. And we could not be more delighted to have Evelynn Hammonds. Indeed, I think it was clear we couldn't organize the symposium without having Evelynn, and so that was an absolute requirement. Was we're going to first make sure we can have Evelynn, and then we'll get the rest of it organized. And I'm so grateful to you for coming. Evelynn is the Barbara Gutmann Rosenkrantz Professor of History of Science and African American Studies at Harvard University, and she has one of these truly scary, smart backgrounds. No. I mean, I just like always in awe of this because she has her undergraduate degree in physics from Spelman College, a bachelor's in electrical engineering and computer science from Georgia Institute of Technology, a master's in physics from MIT, her PhD in the Department of History of Science from Harvard. And so, she comes from both of these worlds of deeply understanding the sciences, deeply understanding the history of science, and she has been the author of highly influential books and articles on both the general questions of the intersection of science, medicine, and the socio-political concepts of race in the United States, and very specific historical studies, including, for example, of the campaign to control diphtheria in New York City at the turn of the 20th century. And so she is an expert in the concepts, an expert in the history, and also a very valued member of this broad community. And we're just really grateful to have you here to properly kick this off. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I'm really happy to be here at the Broad to talk about these issues today. First, I want to thank Eric for that wonderful introduction, and also just for the way he sort of set us up for what we're going to try to address today. So I'm going to begin by just noting that since the passage of the NIH Revitalization Act of 1993, there exists a legal mandate to include a racially diverse population in medical research. Now, in the wake of that mandate, a long-standing problem became more visible to clinical researchers, and that is the difficulty in recruiting a diverse representative sample of participants, which sociologist Stephen Epstein dubbed the vexing and time-consuming body hunt. So it's because this lack of racial representation in clinical research studies has, according to sociologist Ruha Benjamin, it's generated a lot of anxiety, especially in fields ranging from those requiring human tissue samples, to home treatments, to cancer research, to stem cell research. As a result, for example, stem cell banks, report difficulty in building racially diverse collections of tissue. So Benjamin notes a 2006 Hastings Center report that stated stem cell therapies in particular should be available to people of all ethnicities. However, most cells used in the clinic will probably come from the lines of cells stored in stem cell banks, which may end up benefiting the majority group most. And that's just one example of the ways in which what's stored in many of those banks is not representative. And the second issue that I just touch on briefly is the issue about how even cell lines are raced, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. It's a contentious one, especially between social scientists and human geneticists. And I can only talk about that briefly, but after next week when Oprah Winfrey's story of Henrietta Lacks appears on TV, I think we're going to have a lot of discussion about cell lines in a variety of venues. So one of the reasons, and I guess the primary reason, that researchers and policy analysts provide for the low enrollment of African Americans in particular in clinical trials is their tendency to distrust science and medicine. So there have been hundreds of peer-reviewed papers written about how what is now sometimes referred to as simply Black distrust. And this circulates as a biomedical truism, an empirical curiosity, and a cultural trait that in some respects is supposedly unique to African Americans. And indeed, it is seen as an essential feature of a widespread and pervasive feature of medical encounters between African Americans, clinical researchers, and other healthcare providers. So sociologists have described the way this issue of mistrust in medical encounters is ascribed to African Americans as, quote unquote, trust talk. And they acknowledge that one feature of this kind of discourse is how little attention is paid to the normative underpinnings of trust talk. But as a historian of science and medicine, I come at this issue differently than the sociologists. I choose to frame the issue of trust in the context of what I will call resistance to participating in clinical research on the part of African Americans. And I examine the history of the practices that have produced African Americans' resistance to participating in clinical research. Hence my title. It's important to take steps back from the current framing of this issue to examine how this resistance emerged and what has sustained it over time. So today I want to look at two historical moments, my two steps back, and then end with some discussion of the current theories about the framing of the issue of mistrust. So we have to begin with slave health. One of the big debates about slavery among historians was how severe was the institution. Did most slave owners try to provide some reasonable level of care for their slaves in terms of housing, clothing, and even health care? And of course, we know there was wide variation in the provision of these things, but what was the range, historians have asked? For an earlier generation of historians in the early 20th century, the topic of slave health was actually seen as a barometer of how harsh or benign slavery actually was. In the early 20th century African American historian Carter Woodson strenuously disagreed with white historian U.B. Phillips, who argued that slaveholders treated their slaves relatively well. Other historians since then argued that economic interests motivated slave owners to provide good health care for their slaves. Still, others have disagreed with this view, noting that property interests no more protected slaves against abuse than it did the land, the tools, or the livestock of the slaveholders. Now, another question emerged out of this debate. How did enslaved women and men understand their health and practices of healing on the plantation? We know far more about how white physicians thought about slave health than the reverse. But today I want to talk about how the enslaved African Americans dealt with issues of health and healing, drawing from the work of historian Charlotte Fett, and I highly recommend to you her book, Working Cures, Healing, Health, and Power in Southern Slave Plantations. Enslaved African Americans developed a powerful counter-vision of personal and collective endurance, which formed the basis of their ideas about health and healing. They had to form this vision out of the broader experience of being defined as property and their own cultural notions of health and healing. Illness or affliction could rise from conflicts within a broadly defined community of living kin and neighbors, ancestors, and spirits. Enslaved healers working in relation to this spiritual world often described their skills as gifts and attributed their knowledge to divine intervention. So as such, slave healing was an integral part of slave religion. Now, to the extent that they were able, slave owners sought to limit their involvement in the sick care of the enslaved, to examining and prescribing medicine, directing the labor of others to actually care for the sick slaves. And slaveholders convinced themselves that providing some medicines, calling for a white doctor in extreme cases, and allowing some slaves time off in the case of extreme illness constituted caring for the health of their slaves. Slave women were required to take care of all the messy, dirty jobs associated with caring for the sick on the plantations, While some large plantations had something called a sick house, which is usually a building where the sick could be tended to, these buildings were of varying quality. Few were airy, warm, or pleasant places for the sick. But slave women performed all the tasks in these buildings. Now, one of the important contributions that Fett's work makes is to help us see how the vision of slave health by the slaveholders and the enslaved African Americans differed. Slaveholders and white medical professionals viewed the health of black folk through the lens of soundness, as you see on the slide. The term indicated an enslaved person's overall state of health and, by extension, his or her worth in the marketplace. So soundness, in its most basic sense, concerned the health of the slave measured in his or her capacity to labor. For slave women, it also encompassed her capacity to bear children. Not limited to the physical body, the concept of soundness extended to mental and moral dimensions of slave health as well. Slave buyers frequently put questions of character under the general rubric of soundness as well. A slave who exhibited defiant behavior was thought to be unsound. So soundness defined slave health as the capacity to labor, to reproduce, to obey, and to submit. Now, slaves, on the other hand, developed practices and beliefs that health involved self-reliance and faith in God. They learned to use whatever was available to do whatever they could to secure the health of their families under conditions that they did not control. The value of self-reliance wove consistently through African American doctrine. One woman born in slavery remembered, quote, "There were no doctors back there. If you got sick, you would dig a hole and find roots and fix your own medicine," unquote. And as Fett notes, doing for oneself, she says, and one's family required a communal store of mother wit, a blend of God-given wisdom, common sense, the instruction of older women. It required confidence in the legitimacy of African American medical traditions and the authority of those slave healers. After slavery, whites distorted these traditions while emphasizing the benevolent practice of white slaveholders and physicians. They characterized the slaves as ignorant and superstitious as the source of their own health problems. And Southern physicians used their own and others' observations of black medical differences to develop both a partial rationale for enslaving blacks in the American South and a special approach to medical care and treatment of them. It was widely believed by white physicians that African Americans were so different medically that they warranted special treatment with respect to most diseases. They used this idea to argue that slavery was humane and economically viable in the South because African Americans possessed immunity to certain diseases that devastated whites, thereby giving the slave owners a convenient rationale for their exploitation of African Americans by suggesting that it was not cruel to send them to the rice fields or sugarcane fields to work, since they were in less danger of contracting diseases in these environments than were whites. Nor could physicians adequately treat blacks without knowledge of their anatomical and physiological peculiarities and diseases. To them, African Americans were medically different and mentally inferior to the whites, that they would claim. Now, medical and non-medical observers thought that African Americans had a relative immunity to malaria, to yellow fever, to other southern fevers. They were thought to be more susceptible to intestinal and respiratory disease. They were thought to have a greater tolerance for heat and a lower tolerance for cold than whites. Tuberculosis was said to be so virulent in African Americans that many physicians thought it was a different disease called Negro consumption. Southern physicians emphasized these kind of differences while downplaying the role of external causes for the differences in rates of disease between whites and blacks, including inadequate clothing and diet, poor ventilation and sanitation, and direct exposure to germs and bacteria via rodents, insects, and other animals. They explicitly ignored the effects of whippings and beatings and other routine injuries that were inflicted upon the slaves as well. The last and most disturbing aspect of, I just lost my place, okay. The last and most disturbing aspect of white physicians' treatment of the enslaved African Americans was medical experimentation. Indeed, in the antebellum period, slave bodies were those used most often for what was called medical education. Southern physicians advertised in newspapers for sick Negroes considered incurable by their respective physicians, including those with diseases such as scrofula or apoplexy, or diseases of the liver, kidney, spleen, stomach and intestines, bladder and its appendages, diarrhea and dysentery. Southern medical students routinely participated in dissection of human cadavers well before their northern counterparts, in part because of the widespread use of slave bodies. These experiments continued for many, many years, including, as many African American physicians in the 20th century noted, W. Montague Cobb, who was a leading physician, noted in 1930s, that he found a source that described a chilling description of one of the first dissections that was performed in New Hampshire in 1800. At the scene of the execution of a black man for a capital offense, the local physicians were invited to use his body for dissection. And Cobb commented, although New Hampshire's history has been free of lynchings, the events just described came perilously close to qualifying as a legal lynching. He also described a survey he conducted for the American Association of Physical Anthropologists, where he found that even as late as 1933, a number of Southern medical schools still taught their students the fundamentals of human anatomy exclusively through the use of black cadavers. Abolitionist Theodore Weld wrote in 1839, public opinion would tolerate surgical experiments, operations, processes performed upon them, the slaves, which it would execrate, if performed upon their master or other whites. So slaves found themselves as subjects of medical experiments because physicians needed bodies, because the state considered them property and denied them the legal right to refuse to participate. So one of the most egregious cases of medical experimentation in the 19th century is the work of James Marion Sims. There's a statue to him, by the way, in Central Park at 5th Avenue and 103rd Street, in part because he was considered the father of modern gynecology in the United States and had served as president of the American Medical Association. His paper on the treatment of vesicovaginal fistula, which was published in the American Journal of Medical Sciences in 1852, is where he introduced the use of silver wire sutures, the Sims position, and the Sims speculum. He was born and educated in the South and practiced in his native South Carolina and later Alabama. He was also a founder of the Women's Hospital of New York, located in New York City. And as I said, he's almost universally known as the father of modern American gynecology. Now, the story of Sims's rise from an obscure Southern physician to a member of the elite of American physicians has been told many times. But what is of interest, I think, for me and for us in this discussion is how the various narratives of Sims' life address the set of experiments that led to his fame. In 1852, Sims was then practicing in Montgomery, Alabama. He published his paper on the treatment of vesicovaginal fistula. In this paper, he described a new technique for repairing a then common postpartum condition, a tear in the wall separating the bladder from the vagina that rendered its victims incontinent and subject to frequent infections of the reproductive organs and other complications. So the aspect of Sims' operations that has received the most historical attention, if not, in my view, still sufficient analysis, is the fact that 3 of his patients were African-American female slaves, Anarcha, Betsy, and Lucy, and others not named. They underwent numerous surgeries before Sims concluded that he had developed a successful method of treatment. The number of operations that they underwent is shocking. Knocker, Betsy, and Lucy each underwent up to 30 operations over the course of 3.5 years without anesthesia. Now, initially, members of the Montgomery medical community attended Sims's surgeries on these women. However, since he appeared to be having little success, his audience kind of drifted away. And after a few years, even his brother-in-law demanded that he cease these experiments. So Sims found himself operating alone, only with these women to assist him. And I put assist in quotes. And Sims claimed that the slave women involved in these experiments begged him to proceed with further surgery after a lapse of many weeks between operations. They were clamorous, he insisted. These women continued to assist him in surgery despite the repeated operations. And opium was the only drug that he administered to them, which certainly resulted in their addiction, given that they were subjected to the use of it for a fairly long time. He finally discovered that the use of silver wire sutures was the key to repairing these fistulas. And a number of other technical innovations are attributed to Sims as a result of these experiments on these women. As I noted, that he created the duckbill speculum, which transformed the gynecological examination of female patients, the sigmoid catheter, which physicians use to drain urine from wounds. And he published all this work, and with his publication, he developed an international reputation in the field of gynecological surgery. He soon left Montgomery for New York City, where he continued his operations on these fistulas at the New York Women's Hospital, where his patients were largely poor white women, many of them Irish immigrants. The Sims case is unusual for the number of operations performed on slave women, but it is also representative because it demonstrates how pervasive the view that slaves were biologically and physiologically different from whites, which thus made them useful experimental subjects in the minds of white physicians. As a result, in the post-Civil War period and even into the present, African Americans, particularly those in the South, have been wary, if not downright suspicious, of the medical system in this country, which until the present day has been marked by its inattention to African American medical problems and its attention to the use of African Americans in experimental research. So in the post-Civil War period, African Americans continued their struggle to gain health care on their own terms. And while there is no kind of comprehensive study of continuing medical experimentation on African Americans, there is ample data documenting their mistreatment by white physicians. Historian and physician Vanessa Gamble notes that in the 1890s into the early 20th century, prominent black physicians constantly talked about the fact that white physicians, especially in the South, frequently used black patients as guinea pigs. Dr. Nathan Francis Moselle, the founder of Philadelphia's Frederick Douglass Memorial Hospital, described, quote, the fears and prejudices of black people, especially those from the South, as almost proverbial, he said. He attributed such attitudes to Southern medical practice in which black people were forced to accept hospital attention, got only the poorest care, being placed in inferior wards set apart for them, suffering the brunt of all that is experimental in treatment. So through the early decades of the 20th century, the health of African Americans in the South and urban areas continued to raise alarms among all observers. Tuberculosis rates were high throughout the South. TB treatment facilities and sanatoriums for blacks were grossly inadequate, segregated by law as well as by institutional practice, and considered by black and white medical authorities involved in black health affairs as a national disaster. In 1936, the National Tuberculosis Association published its results of a 5-year study of TB among blacks, and it revealed that in some southern states, the ratio of black deaths from TB to available hospital beds for TB patients was as high as 20 to 1. An African-American physician, Dr. Charles Payne, called it the stark tragedy of the Southland. Black medical professionals in the 20th century continually made the case that Black people preferred Black medical professionals over white. One Black physician noted, experience based on a period of 10 years, he said, has shown that in Baltimore, colored patients prefer to be treated by colored physicians. The reason for this was in substance cultural, although some saw it in racial terms. And this is unquestionably due to a psychological understanding of racial problems which the average white physician of that time, he noted, does not possess. By the 1920s, historian David McBride notes, great numbers of Americans had been impressed by the physician and hospital care that they were receiving with increasing regularity. This is a period of explosion of hospitals around the country. Moreover, the white middle class was bombarded with popular health literature published by medical and public health professions. Magazines such as Hygeia was published by the AMA, The Nation's Health published by the APHA. These magazines disseminated the gospel of personal hygiene and scientific medicine. And the result of their efforts, historians note, was a growth of positive feeling for public health measures, scientific medicine, and scientific research, which quickly permeated the fabric of American life. But these movements to popularize the medical profession and scientific medicine had little attractiveness to the masses of African Americans during this period, 1920s through the Depression years. And David McBride argues that a folk health system interlacing Afro-Christian religious worldviews, an abundance of dynamic faith in women healers, the omnipresent Black spiritual church, widespread magical beliefs were still powerful forces in urban Black working class communities, North and South, during the Depression. So historians have concluded that African Americans were immersed in a fluctuating cultural and folk healing world that blended agrarian, African, and spiritualist ingredients. Though they were trapped at the nation's socioeconomic bottom and segregated from most of the nation's mainstream public health and physician resources, the cultural movement to exalt scientific medicine was initially of little importance to typical urban Black communities. Indeed, even Black medical professionals were skeptical of an appeal to the authority of scientific medicine when applied to Black people. Charles Roman, who was president of the National Medical Association, noted, in medicine, the Negro is alike blameworthy for anaphylaxis and blameworthy for immunity. If he is susceptible to a disease such as tuberculosis, he is a weakling. If he is not susceptible to a disease such as hookworm, he's a menace. And thus these pejorative claims to racial differences and susceptibility and immunity to disease also shaped African Americans' negative responses to scientific medicine throughout the 20th century. So my second step back in time is to look at the influence of the infamous Tuskegee syphilis study, which many of you may know about. A quick review of the study. It's a 40-year-long study from 1932 to 1972 in which 399 Black men from Macon County, Alabama, were deliberately denied effective treatment for syphilis in order to document the natural history of the disease. The study has been the subject of several important books and journal articles, a play, a movie, and in 1997, then President Bill Clinton issued an apology to the survivors, and he said, the legacy of the study at Tuskegee has reached far and deep in ways that hurt our progress and divide our nation. We cannot be one America when a whole segment of our nation has no trust in America. Now, as the historian Vanessa Gamble noted at that moment, it had been 25 years after the public disclosure of Tuskegee, and the study had by then moved from being a singular historical event to a powerful metaphor. It has come to symbolize racism in medicine, misconduct in human research, the arrogance of physicians, and government abuse of Black people. Indeed, numerous articles began to appear in the 1990s claiming that knowledge of this horrific study itself was the cause of or predisposed many African Americans to distrust medical and public health authorities and led to critically low Black participation in clinical trials and organ donation. So I do not give much credence to that argument, and I hope that I've already shown you that distrust preceded the Tuskegee study. On a personal note, my father, who passed away 2 years ago this spring, expressed great distrust in the medical system. He had spent his entire life in the American South. He, along with many others of his generation in my family, were far more affected by the encounters they had with white physicians over the course of their lifetimes than they were with the singular event of the Tuskegee study. So it is indisputable that the distrust of that generation of African Americans, the distrust that they had of institutions of medicine and public health, clearly predates the public revelation of the Tuskegee study. And for historians, the focus on this study, the problem with focusing on this study, is that it places a single historical event to explain deeply entrenched and complex attitudes within African American communities. So analysts have long established that trust, of course, is a critical aspect of medical care. That includes perceptions of healthcare providers' technical ability, interpersonal skills, and the extent to which the patient perceives that his or her welfare is placed above other considerations. Recent studies have gone on to distinguish between interpersonal and societal distrust, where interpersonal distrust is based on personal experiences and interactions of individuals within healthcare or clinical research settings, and societal distrust is characterized by a global negative outlook on clinical research based on perceptions of collective research entities or life experiences in society at large. So it's clear that the cultural concept of trust has been racialized in the context of biomedicine. As Ruha Benjamin notes, what has occurred is the creation of a binary opposition between white people's trust and Black people's distrust, okay? And we forget what underpins this kind of opposition. It's driven by the racial logics that I have tried to show are historically based. But this opposition also posits the view that the kind of distrust that African Americans have is somehow deeply cultural to the point of almost being a biological difference. And what we've done is ignore the basis for historically informed interrogation of the factors that make trust possible and distrust a sign of resistance. So if we look at a review of some recent papers, Patient Mistrust in Genomic Medicine and Medical Research, there's a well-grounded documented historically grounded mistrust of medical research among African American patients. People keep noting this. African American patients are more likely to believe that the benefits of genetic research will not return back to their community and are more suspicious than whites of race-based strategies for tailoring medical treatment. And therefore, they're less willing to participate in these genetics research, in biobanks, and cancer clinical trials. In genomics research, there are concerns about privacy, their distrust of researchers, and some even believe that participation might lead to discrimination from groups like Medicaid or insurance companies, and therefore, again, supports the lower enrollment in cancer genetics network among African Americans. In the North Carolina colorectal cancer study, African Americans were less likely to give a blood sample compared with whites, and those who felt less trust for research and researchers were even less likely to have given a sample. So, and African American women, I think this last point is important. African American women with higher medical mistrust consistently show lower genetic counseling and testing engagement for BRCA1 and 2. The legacy of Tuskegee and Henrietta Lacks are still pervasive determinants today. I think it's not just those two, and I'll talk about Lacks in a minute, but I don't like us to frame it in terms of the legacy of Tuskegee. It's the legacy of mistreatment of Black people in this country since the time of slavery. Tuskegee is just one incident on that timeline. Now, the case of HeLa cells, as I said, there's the movie about this is going to appear in the next few days, starring Oprah Winfrey. For those of you who don't know, the tumor tissue of an African-American woman named Henrietta Lacks, who lived in Baltimore, was immortalized into HeLa cells and used in medical experimentation over many decades across the world, leading to many, many medical discoveries and generating corporate profits. Now, neither Henrietta Lacks, who died from cervical cancer, nor her children knew that her tissue had been used to make these cell lines for decades. Her children have lived in poverty, they've dealt with chronic illnesses, they've lacked health insurance, while her cells have generated corporate profits for over 6 decades. So many, many people in the African American community know about the story of Henrietta Lacks. And after next week, a whole lot of people are going to know the story about Henrietta Lacks. And it will raise again a lot of public discussion about the use of African American bodies in medical research. And the questions that will be raised may not be ones that many people would like to answer. Other recurring problems that African Americans have experienced through participation in scientific research that engender mistrust include African American community leaders being invited and participants invited into the research process only after the research project has been designed. African American community leaders are often used merely as entry points to the bodies needed to do the research. This is sort of similar to the role that Nurse Eunice Rivers played in the Tuskegee syphilis study. Nurse Rivers was the Black nurse who went out into the fields and farms around Macon County and encouraged Black men to join the study. She was the person who kept the men in the study. But even as she gained some knowledge about the failure of the study, she did not have the authority to end it. She had no authority in that study except to be the face of the study and to be the enabler of the recruitment of African American men. Researchers neglect to come back to participating in communities with the products of their investigations, and often research institutions fail to offer adequate resources and credit to the communities that make their studies possible. So, future directions. Focus groups with leaders in the African American community have shown that in order for scientists and academic institutions to get African Americans to participate in genetic studies, in genomic studies, in clinical research studies, certain conditions for engaging the community must be fulfilled. Respect for the community, and the values and traditions and ideas and feelings must also be considered. That's under authentic community collaboration. Bidirectional education, that is, white researchers have to understand that maybe their research subjects have something to teach them. There needs to be transparency and accountability and meaningful benefits and remuneration. And I think one major key to producing more racially diverse populations for clinical research is to increase the racial diversity of the investigators. And for those who are not African American, to have white investigators learn more of this history so they actually stand in the face of their subjects with a deep understanding of a past that has such a major part of shaping beliefs and resistance to participation in clinical trials by African Americans. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks so much. That was a really wonderful lecture and a great introduction to this symposium today. So we have some time for questions if people would like to raise your hands or come up to the mic.
So I learned the story this week about Gardasil. For those of you who don't know, Gardasil is the vaccine for against HPV, which causes cervical cancer. And the original Gardasil was just based on 2 strains of 100 possible strains for the virus. And in fact, though this was promoted for all young women, the strains that were selected did not protect the African American community because the strains of the virus that impact them are different to the ones that were included. So, you know, this is like not an old story. This is 2013 Duke did the study that unveiled this. But, you know, I just want to support your statement that we need to have a diverse community inside the labs, because this is the way that we will actually, in my view, kind of change the dynamic and make sure that patients are included, but researchers are actually the key to this. Thank you very, very, very much.
Thank you. No, I completely agree. We have to, if we're not going to keep repeating this, some of the kinds of practices that I've tried to discuss, the only way we can stop doing it is to understand this history, and to understand the kinds of fears and resistance that Black people will have, and other groups, other minority groups as well have, because of their experiences. These feelings don't come from nowhere. They don't necessarily come from stories on television. They come from their actual lived experience. And we have to be aware of that if we're going to do something different.
Any other comments or questions? Yeah, Sheila.
I just want to know, as a patient advocate, I was diagnosed with metastatic 7 years ago, and clinical trials was not, I didn't know about them, but I knew about them because of my doctor. She said clinical trials. So I want to know, what can I do as a patient advocate and an NBC patient to further or bridge the gap or go into my community and offer them a better understanding of, we need to be in these, as Black women, we need to be, and men, we need to be in these clinical trials. So what can I do to take back to my community?
So let me ask you one question back. And how has your experience been?
Awesome.
That's what you take back. That's what you have to take back. Because you have to speak directly to the fears that people have in your community about participating in these trials. Am I going to be treated well, they might ask? Is somebody really going to care about me? Are they going to help me make really informed decisions? Are they going to try to push me in one direction that I don't want to go in? Are they going to help me understand some things that are pretty technical? Are they going to help me explain to my children what it might mean for how long I might be ill, or if I will die, or how much time I actually have, or any of those kinds of things? And are they really going to care about me and my life and its broad complexity? And if you can say, look, the people I deal with do those things and care about me and answer those questions honestly, then I think that's what you want to convey as an advocate. That there's a benefit to participating in a trial that could help. It helped you, it could help other folks, but we have to be there in order to get those benefits.
Hi. I think that there's a tension that I'd like to see if we could talk about as a group, where investigators feel that they have very little time to, they're trying to address the issue of recruitment into their studies as efficiently as possible. And I think that the pressures have led to some really disturbing culture, where they, for example, within the clinical translation, the CTSAs across the country, these big infrastructure grants, they have a mandatory community engagement component. But what it's turned into in many CTSAs across the country is a shop of people who are supposed to be networked into communities of color in particular. And these are people who are supposed to access Black bodies for investigators, who are supposed to have the relationships, be able to help with recruitment of minorities into studies. But it's kind of, the investigators aren't doing it themselves. They aren't developing those relationships because it's seen as too time intensive. That they don't have the time themselves to go out into community health centers or YMCAs or churches or wherever to establish those relationships long term, because it's too intense to build and nurture and maintain those relationships with minority community leaders and the minority community organizations. So I think that kind of handing off or subbing out the relationship building and maintaining is a horrible thing, because it ends up degenerating into almost like put in a quarter and get Black bodies in its worst form. And occasionally the investigators will go out into the community and present, and maybe present the research results at the end. But I think that the pressures on the investigator in terms of publishing, in terms of getting the project mounted are substantial, particularly in an institution like Harvard. So could you speak to that in terms of the real practical pressures on the investigator, who have to be churning out in this environment R01s every few months, and the intensive work that it really takes to develop real human relationships with community leaders and maintain them over time?
So, as an African-American historian of science, citizen of the United States, I have no patience with that. I have no patience with researchers who cannot find a reasonable way to engage with the people who benefit their research and make it possible for them to stay viable members of the Harvard University community. I don't have any patience with that. So you're going to take a shorthand and farm out some people to round up some Black people for you, and you can study them, and then you never see them again, and you're walking around bragging about your latest R01. I have no patience with that, because that is the kind of attitude that's deeply embedded in this history of white physicians' exploitation of peoples of color in this country. It has to stop. If you want to use my body to get my anything, DNA, spit, blood, organ, you're going to have to treat me like a human being of equal status to you. That is the next paradigm. If there's no shorthand for that paradigm, there is no shorthand for that paradigm, because any shorthand exploits vulnerable people around the country. And as far as I'm concerned, if you don't have time to do it as a researcher, then you shouldn't be doing the work. There's a right way to do this, and there's a wrong way to do it. And I'm sorry to be emotional, but I feel very strongly that what I've tried to tell you is a story of continuing exploitation. Then it's about dehumanizing and othering groups of people who had no legal recourse to fight back. And even today, I will be concerned about loss of insurance, loss of life, all kinds of physical debilitation. And you're going to ask them to trust you when the researchers don't have time to even consider them as equal partners in the project. So that's my rant of the day.
Tanya.
Thank you so much. I was wondering if you could comment a little bit on how we should think about the marketing of drugs like Bidil. I feel like there's a tendency to use race as a proxy for biogeographical ancestry or something that would be more appropriate. And how do we ensure that we're both designing and serving the African American population in the design of drugs without reifying social or biological concepts that are not accurate?
Yeah, so Bidil, it's a complicated one, because on the one hand, many African-American cardiologists wanted the license for Bidil to be extended when it was found through a very small study that it had some greater efficacy for African-American populations, which is the only way the FDA would have extended their license in the first place. Okay, so so some black cardiologists were saying, well, finally, a drug that works for us. We should be behind it. But and of course, we don't want anybody who needs the drug not to get it. But on the other hand, the way that sort of race was used in that is the problematic aspect of it. And I think the company was in fact the greatest perpetrator of wanting to extend their license, make more money, and if it meant stretching a little bit of the results so that you could get a different population to use your drugs, well, that's what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to make money off their drugs. But I don't think the FDA was particularly willing to listen to an argument that said, we're on a slippery slope. If we start saying, if we're targeting drugs to populations based on not the most robust kind of evidence, then one of the things we're doing is reifying the issue of race and racial difference, which again is a very old story. The only way we can stop reifying race and racial differences is to stop reifying race and racial differences, right? So even if that means some people may not make the kind of money they want to make on these new drugs.
Bridget.
So I'm an advocate and also so honored and privileged to be a part of this project. In Seattle, I live in Seattle, I became metastatic 3.5 years ago. And I've been advocating for now 21 years and educating the community about the importance of clinical trials to my community. And so when I became metastatic, after that, I went to the oncologist that I was assigned to and told her I would like to get in a clinical trial. She refused me for 3 years, so I have another doctor now.
Good.
And so in that, but that just doesn't happen to me. It happens to many, many people in the Northwest. And so we've got a small population of African American, and usually when the researchers are doing outreach to them, they say, well, it's only 10% of blacks that are in Seattle. If we reach one, we've reached our 10%, which is very sad. So with my changing to the new doctor, now I'm NED and I'm in a clinical trial. And this particular doctor is very open to clinical trials. And so we're looking to find out how can we reach the physician after you come out of the lab as researchers. How are we going to change the culture of the doctors who have racism as they're in the clinic, but they're having to treat the African Americans and those that are underserved. And so underhandedly, they're killing them off, and we are fighting for our lives.
Well, that's an extremely good question and a complex one. How do we change the culture? How do we change people's behaviors? I mean, that's probably worth the rest of the day's discussion. But where I would start is to say we really need leadership, we need leaders in medical education to begin to take a very firm stand that medical training has to include the kind of history that I've talked about. It has to include work that would show physicians in training how racism is embedded in certain medical practices. And to me, through doing that, we could try to change the behavior of the coming generations. What we do about the ones right now, that's a harder one to figure out. But I do think there's hope for the future.
So, as you know, there have been put in place a number of mechanisms to increase awareness of history in this area. Researchers are required to go through certain types of training to get their grants funded that increases awareness of Tuskegee and as a prominent example. And so in some sense, that's a good thing, that more people, more researchers could explain what the Tuskegee study was and why it was problematic. And yet, it also seems to have relegated this fundamentally important issue of social justice to a box checking. So, it's here are 17 things that are, rules and regulations to comply with to get your federally funded grant to come through, and this is this is number 18.
Right.
So the question is, do you agree with that, and are there ways that we could approach education in a more effective way that makes it perhaps more emotional than it is at the moment?
No, I absolutely agree with you. When I was teaching at MIT, every summer a couple of biologists, good people, would invite me to speak to their lab about Tuskegee, and I'd do it. And it never occurred to me that I just thought they thought that would be an interesting thing to do, since I was a historian of medicine. And then it finally occurred to me that I was the box that they were checking. That I was making it possible for them to check the box. Oh, Evelynn came, she showed some slides, thanks, bam, done. And so I stopped doing it. I said, I'm not gonna let you off the hook like this, guys. And so, yeah, it just has to go deeper. I mean, sort of bureaucratic kinds of fixes like that, like saying like the mandate to diversify populations. That's a good thing, but how it's implemented has been extremely problematic. And somebody needs to get back into the implementation aspect and talk about those problematic aspects. And just as I said in answer to the last question, the other thing is real education about medical practices within and through and use of vulnerable populations. And it's not a checkbox, and it's not one lecture on Tuskegee. It is probably a full course that engages students across who are diverse students themselves to deal with the history and deal with examples that are relevant and meaningful to what they have to do in the lab and the clinic every day.
I just want to go back to the CTSAs. I was recruited to be a community partner or whatever on the advisory boards in the first iteration here, and I had read, as had some of the other people in our group, Harriet Washington's book, and so I was asked to go out with 2 African American women and a woman from a white minority to have a discussion which could be summarized as, do I pimp my people? You know, these are people who are employed, they're supporting families. They were asked to do this. We had this long discussion about it. The decision was that, yes, the clinical trials were important and the recruitment was important, but there were these other issues which never really got resolved. So I guess I'm wondering, where do you put your foot down? I mean, all of us wound up eventually just dropping off as the huge flow of money went into drug research. But it's like hard to, you know, sort of cut loose if you're looking for jobs and this is an entryway into the medical world for people from communities.
Yeah, that's a hard question. I don't think I'm qualified to answer that one, except to say that this is, I think Eric said it right earlier today, this is necessary work going forward. And I just don't think there's any way to avoid it. Even if funding dries up, people have to try to find a way to keep being out in the communities and keep working hard to make communities people in communities real partners with the researchers. That is what's going to help make it change.
Maybe I'll ask the last question.
Okay.
Related to Todd's point, we have a lot of young people, young scientists here who are either running or designing or thinking about designing their own studies, and you put up a lot of really great, I think, important advice to the 2 young scientists on your last few slides. So, would you have any words for someone who wants to make sure their research is inclusive? How to begin? How to think about doing this?
Take my class.
Yeah. How do they do that?
No, I was only kidding. I have too many students. No, I think, you know, you have to read. So I think it would be good if what came out of this meeting is a really good starting place of materials for people to read and then engage in discussion about those readings. Okay?
Great. Well, thank you again for a really wonderful lecture. Let's give a round of applause.
Thank you.
I'd like to now introduce our next speaker. It's my great pleasure to introduce Rachel Friedman, who's an assistant professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School. She's a senior physician in breast oncology at the Susan Smith Center for Women's Cancers and the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, and is the medical director of the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute Network. She also practices at Dana-Farber's outreach clinic at the Whittier Street Health Center in Roxbury. And her research focuses on the care of vulnerable populations. And today she's going to be speaking to us about the importance of diversity in clinical research. Rachel.
That's a tough act to follow. Thank you so much, Professor Hammonds, for setting up the stage. And I think you've all sort of given my talk already, because so many of the issues raised in questions and comments and the history provided really is woven into this talk, and I hope we can build upon it and use this as a springboard for additional dialogue on this incredibly important issue. I feel funny making the case for the importance of diversity of our trial participants to this audience, because you're obviously all here and are very committed to this issue. But I will take this opportunity to stress the importance of diversity in every aspect of medical care, from our workforce to our patients to our research. And I look forward to the discussions ongoing today. So thank you so much for allowing me to be a part of this event. So I thought that I would start out with a patient case to kind of bring it back to some of the clinical aspects that I deal with in clinical law. This is a case, a woman named SD, who's a 47-year-old African-American woman who has hypertension or high blood pressure, who presented with a right-sided 2-centimeter hormone receptor negative HER2 positive breast cancer. And she had 1 out of 4 lymph nodes involved. She's now had her surgery, which included lymph node assessment and breast surgery, and she's coming back to me to discuss the next steps. And for those of you who aren't familiar with clinical care in breast cancer, we would typically recommend a course of chemotherapy and a course of HER2-directed therapy because she has a HER2-positive breast cancer. Those would tend to be the standard offerings in this situation. And as I think about the treatment plan, we always want to consider, of course, what treatment regimen we want to give her, what are the anticipated side effects and benefits of that treatment, and what kind of monitoring will she need while she's on treatment and beyond. And unfortunately, a lot of data now exists which strongly support the use of trastuzumab in HER2-positive breast cancer, yet we have little information on many subgroups who are, of course, largely underrepresented in all of the large adjuvant trials that led to the FDA approval of this agent. For example, the N98B31 trial, which is also called the joint analysis, which was reported in the New England Journal, reported no race or ethnicity in their Table 1 patient characteristics. In a simultaneous publication in the same New England Journal issue, the HERA trial, which was also a very large adjuvant study, did report race, but as you can see, under 1% of patients on this trial were Black. And the numbers of other subgroups were also low. And a third practice-changing publication on the BCIRG-006 trial also neglected to report patient subgroups on the study, with little attention paid to age, race, ethnicity, or comorbidity in these studies mentioned. And as we've been talking about, this is not something that has gone away. And even with more recent clinical trials, which use the newest targeted agents for HER2 breast cancer, such as the Cleopatra trial shown here, which was also published in the New England Journal and looking at a newer agent in HER2-positive breast cancer called pertuzumab, this also failed to enroll a diverse set of patients, despite enrolling in 25 countries around the world. And that's why the numbers of Asian women were higher in this, because there were a lot of international countries with primarily Asian patients, but less than 4% of patients were Black on this study. And so as we come back to our case, we can of course look to clinical trials which enrolled nearly 10,000 patients to decide on what regimen to give her, what the expected side effects might be, and whether any adjustments need to be made for her cardiac monitoring plan, which is something that we keep in mind when somebody's on trastuzumab, which has a very low but well-described rate of cardiac damage while people are on treatment. So we have to extrapolate data to choose her treatment plan. We have to extrapolate data for her to know her side effects and what her actual benefits might be. And we really have to extrapolate data to understand how to best monitor her. And do we need any adjustments in her care plan and beyond? We just don't know. And this is not just about race. This is also about patients with elevated comorbidity, patients who are very old and also forgotten in clinical trials, and our youngest patients who are often not enrolled as well. So as we started to talk about, this has not gone unnoticed in the last few decades. Our former Senator Ted Kennedy sponsored a bill, which we started to talk about, which mandated that any NIH grant application has to have a section in there that shows how you're going to care about minority and actually women in your grant process and in your research. And although this is on paper a very nice idea, what you've all eloquently brought out is how little this really translates into what we're doing and into real practice. And in total, 1% to 3% of patients with cancer currently participate in clinical trials, which is of course a very small sliver of our big population. And yet everyday patients are older than those on clinical trials. They're less healthy than those on clinical trials, and they're more diverse than those on clinical trials. And if you look at this study, which actually took patients enrolled to NCI-sponsored treatment trials in the US during 2000 to 2002, this looked at 75,000 cancer patients who were enrolled. 86% of them were white. And if you look at all cancers here, the enrollment fraction, so that's the number or the percent of patients enrolled from that subgroup over a denominator of the entire number of incident cases in the US of cancer, white women had 1.8% of all cancer patients participated in trials, whereas 1.3% of Black patients participated in trials, and were much less likely to participate. 29% less likely to participate on trials. And if you look at breast cancer specifically in this table, you find similar things. We did a little bit better with our enrollment fractions, but still 26% less likely to enroll in trial if you were Black or white if you had breast cancer in the US during this time period. And as you've been hearing, so I just dedicated one quick slide because I knew I was up against Professor Hammonds before here, but we have a very long and dark history of misconduct abuse, which has significantly contributed to what I've just shown you. This is a picture of Henrietta Lacks in the right, and this is a picture from a Tuskegee study of a patient giving blood, getting their blood drawn. And this led to the Belmont Report, which is, of course, another national government move to try to make this better, which improved our ethical process in clinical trials. But as we all have been sharing, some of these moves by our government and regulating bodies don't always translate into what we want it to. And of course, the book by Harriet Washington was raised earlier. This is really a dark history which has gone on for centuries and goes well beyond these two events that I've put here. And there are, of course, long-lasting repercussions of this history. This is an article that was in the New York Times last December, which was highlighting how, although immunotherapy is the promise and of a lot of cancers, that African Americans have been left out of these clinical trials, and as money pours into this research, there are certainly groups who are left behind. And there have also been many papers and books about the generations of bad blood since the Tuskegee study, which have continued to propagate the feelings that we have in our country. And so in addition to the distrust and all the historical things that we've been talking about today, there are many barriers to clinical trial enrollment that get in our way, both on a system provider side and also on the patient side. We all know that eligibility requirements for clinical trials can be very stringent. You have to have almost perfect organ function and almost perfect blood counts and very little in the way of coexisting medical conditions in order to qualify for a lot of studies. And as we all know, the real population out there has a lot of medical conditions and a lot of medications that get that could potentially restrict their clinical trial enrollment. There are issues with access to trials, and we all know that the vast majority of cancer patients actually get their care in community centers, yet most of the clinical trials are done at big academic centers where the community centers don't have the same access to clinical trials and don't want to lose their patients to the big academic medical centers, which may limit their referrals. Trials are also very complex, which are overwhelming to both providers and patients with all the steps required, the screening, the follow-up, sometimes biopsies that are required, and lots of clinics have minimal staff or resources to really sit down and educate that patient. Everybody's in a rush, and it's really hard to slow down and try to spend time with that person to explain what you're doing and why you're thinking about it. Consents are also incredibly complicated. I printed a consent for a patient yesterday, which was 35 pages of fine print, and that's not that unusual, and it's so overwhelming and daunting for both staff and patients to get through that. And of course, we've already alluded to provider preferences, so providers think they know who should go on and not go on studies, and of course, we're wrong a lot of the time. There's lots of patient factors beyond the trust issues. As I mentioned, they may have other coexisting medical conditions that are more of a priority. They have preferences, their families have preferences, they have beliefs, fears, and misconceptions about any other experience that they've had or their family member had. Sometimes low health literacy just makes them not understand any of this. There's obviously socioeconomic and educational factors, and the same thing goes the other way, where providers don't want to lose their patients, but there's this sense that patients don't want to leave providers to go to another center to go on a clinical trial because they feel attached and they have a sense of home there. And so this is just a small list of a very long list, but just to highlight some of the other things that come through besides some of the historical stuff that we've been talking about. And although this is meant to talk about diversity with regard to race and ethnicity, I can't help myself but also point out some other subgroups that are also forgotten and need to be a part of the conversation or any conversation about inclusive research. Accrual of the oldest patients with cancer has also been a very difficult challenge nationally. And this is a paper that looked at NCI trials by age over the course of time. And in blue are patients age 75 and older with cancer. In yellow are those age 65 to 74. And in gray are those under 65. And as you can see, and I'll show you in a few slides, the majority of cancer patients are actually in the older age group across the US, yet we have stagnant and very low accrual of these patients as well, with, in the most recent year on this, 9% of patients age 75 and older in 2011. And I've been very interested in this with regard to breast cancer. And we recently looked at breast cancer specific trials in the Alliance for Clinical Trials in Oncology, which was formerly the CALGB, a cooperative group that runs clinical trials in conjunction with the NCI. And we looked at protocols in the preoperative setting, the postoperative setting, and the metastatic setting by age. And again, very stagnant accrual over time for older age groups. And so I'm sort of speaking to the choir here, but just to kind of get back to why we're all here today, why is diversity so important? Well, we all know it's the right thing to do. We all know that we need to do this. We need to understand the biological, epidemiological, genetic, and outcome determinants to improve health for all. And we will never equalize care if we don't address diversity in the science of our work. And it's quite possible that equal care is not what we need, because some patients may need different care. And I think the key is to sort that out. We want equal outcomes, but patients may need different care to get there. And we will never equalize our outcomes if we cannot provide access for all. Even with the best drug that's out there, we'll never do better if we can't get that drug to that patient at the right time. And so just to talk about the things I'll cover in the remainder of the talk, I'll just talk a little bit about the US landscape, which was alluded to earlier today, some actual treatment disparities in biology that we've been seeing in the literature, and then sort of continue the conversation of where we can do better. And so the US population is changing, and the distribution of our US population is going to be vastly different in the year 2060, even compared to the year 2014. And by 2060, it's estimated that 56.4 Americans will be from minority groups. So again, the majority of our population. The US population is also aging, and by the year 2050, approximately 20% of adults will be in the 65 and older age group. And if you look at even the oldest persons in the US, so these are all patients who are 65 and older, among the older adults, the oldest are also a vastly growing population, and those age 85 and older are going to comprise about 20% of this age group also by the year 2050. And the thing is that incidence differs for all of these different subgroups. And this is just one slide. It's hard to find big summary slides, but this is a slide looking at all cancers combined by race and ethnicity, diagnoses from 1999 to 2013 for men. And in red, you can see that Black men have the highest incidence of cancer in the US over time. And although there have been decreases, they still remain the highest. The lowest here are the Asian and Pacific Islanders in the blue and the green. And we also know that the risk for cancer increases with age. So if you look at all sites, if you're somebody age 0 to 49, your risk of developing cancer is 1 in 18 if you're a woman, and 1 in 30 if you're a man, whereas once you've reached a age group of 70 and older, you're down to statistics of 1 in 3 or 1 in 4 developing breast cancer. And you can see similar trends across most of the common cancers that I've put here. So this is breast cancer, and aging disease, as well as colon cancer, lung cancer, and prostate cancer. And there are other changes that are also impacting our cancer landscape and landscape of cancer risk. So we're seeing big declines in cigarette smoking. So compared to 42% of those smoking in 1965, in 2015, about 15% of adults were smoking. But we are seeing an increase in things like e-cigarettes, perhaps water pipe smoking, perhaps marijuana smoking. There are also increases in obesity around the US, which are going to affect cancer rates. And of course, with all of our political climate, there are potentially going to be changes in the numbers of uninsured or numbers of underinsured, which we know can affect health in big ways. We also are seeing more HPV-related cancers, but we're also seeing more vaccine use, and so I think the natural history of diseases related to HPV is also going to change. And so if we do the math and step back, if we have more diverse patients from all these subgroups over time, with many of these subgroups having higher risk of breast cancer or other cancers, we're going to see more older, diverse patients with cancer. And given all of this, we really have to be ready for a cancer landscape that's changing with regard to epidemiology, biology, access to care, and outcomes for all of these patients. And so the concern that all of us have is that as this landscape changes, we're already seeing disparities. Are they going to worsen as our population makeup changes? And I think it's always nice to step back and just say, what are we talking about when we say disparities and cancer disparities? And the NCI has defined this as adverse differences in cancer incidence, prevalence, mortality, survivorship, and burden of cancer or related health conditions that exist among specific population groups in the US. And they list here ones that they've included in their definition. I've added a few more at the bottom, and there are, of course, more to think about. But people who are poor, lack health insurance, and who are medically underserved in any way often bear a greater burden of disease than the general population. And we know that disparities in survival by race have persisted over time. And if you take breast cancer, for instance, I'm sorry that this is a busy slide, but this is showing you all races, white patients, and then Black patients with different year intervals here in the columns. And as you can see, for white and Black patients for breast cancer, there are improvements in survival over time for both subgroups. But there's a lag in that approval, in that improvement for Black patients. And so the disparity is actually widening despite improvement in survival for all groups because it's happening at a slower pace. And the same is true for lung cancer, which has low survival rates, unfortunately, and prostate cancer, which has much better survival rates, but still disparities by race. And this is not just a national problem. We'd all like to maybe tell ourselves that, but this is a local problem as well. Cancer in Boston is also a problem, and Boston cancer mortality rates are actually the worst for Black patients in any other subgroup. And this made some news a few years ago when a paper was published highlighting 50 US cities with the worst Black-white breast cancer mortality differences, and Boston was on that map, which I've put on this curve here, with increasing trend in the difference. So this is Black divided by white breast cancer mortality. And what I put on the right side are just the SEER cancer registry data with Blacks in the blue triangles and white patients in the red squares. And you can see that disparity widening as you get towards 2011. We also see worse breast cancer outcomes at the extremes of age, and what I've highlighted here with the star are the youngest and the oldest patients with breast cancer who have the worst breast cancer-specific survival at 5 years compared to any other age group. And we all know that access affects outcomes too across all race ethnicities, and the likelihood of being diagnosed with an advanced stage breast cancer and other cancers is much higher if you don't have private insurance or actually Medicare, as shown here. And there are countless studies showing differences in socioeconomic factors and access with regard to receipt of treatment, outcomes, in every aspect of cancer care. And as we step back and say, why is this happening? Why are we seeing all of this? Obviously it's not just clinical trials. I think we all know, especially those who study this disease, that there's heterogeneous tumor biology and genomics, even within the same cancer and even within the same subtype. You can have two patients with a triple-negative breast cancer that behave completely differently. And we do not yet understand why that is and what drives that. In cancer care, you also need multiple providers and treatment steps, and you need timely access to specialty care. Particularly in breast cancer, a person may need 4 different providers: a surgeon, a radiation doctor, a medical oncologist, a plastic surgeon, and whoever else you bring in along the way. And getting all this coordinated is extremely complicated and overwhelming. Decision-making can often be nuanced and really complicated. I'm often talking about options and differences with small percentage points, and it's really difficult to convey that in a meaningful way. There's also a very prolonged time commitment to complete therapy in many cancers, and this is the issue in breast cancer, where your initial therapy in the setting of hormone receptor positive breast cancer is often followed by years of oral therapy, and your outcome really depends on your adherence to that oral therapy, which can create issues with regard to out-of-pocket cost and adherence. And as more and more oral therapies become available, we all get so excited for the next oral agent to come out that's targeted and has, the most wonderful side effect profile, but they're costly, and then we have to worry about whether patients are actually taking them. And this is getting more and more complicated. So as every new agent gets approved, comes a whole new set of hurdles to get those agents to those patients who need them the most. And so now that I'm overwhelming you with all the problems, I think there are lots of opportunities to start reducing disparities that can happen anywhere on the cancer care continuum, from screening to diagnosis to treatment and survivorship and surveillance. And there are, of course, patient factors that can be modified, and I've listed a lot of things here, and this is just a limited list. There are also provider factors and system factors that we all know can be better to reduce disparities. And then, of course, there are some disease factors, some of which may be modifiable with regard to stage and getting patients seen earlier in the course of their diagnosis. But there are also some biological and genetic things that we may not be able to change, but perhaps we can intervene on in a different way. And so this is also an issue that was raised earlier today, and this goes back centuries. This was actually just premiered in The Lancet this week, and in their, it's only online right now, but there are a series of articles in this week's Lancet which really talk about needing to tackle structural racism. So as we think about the providers and the systemic things that are happening both at the hospital and doctor level, but also in our society, we really need to think about the ways that our society fosters racial discrimination through everything: housing, education, employment, earnings, benefits, credits, media, healthcare, and criminal justice. If we don't root out all of these things, this all contributes to health, and these things need to be addressed as well. And so we see, just bringing it back to breast cancer, because I know that that's the focus of many of you in the room, and that's what I focus on, we really do see lower rates of treatment for Black women with breast cancer. And there are many studies now documenting this, looking at more delays seen in this subgroup, lower dose intensity given, more non-standard chemotherapy use, more likely to miss appointments, less likely to complete therapy and adhere to oral medications, particularly when the copay burden is high. And these lower rates of treatment are also documented for other subgroups as well, as I've alluded to. And so I just wanted to touch on a little potpourri of some treatment disparities and some of the creative ways that we started to think about this. But this goes back to actually our patient case, which is looking at trastuzumab receipt for minority populations and for those with lower educational status. And so this was a paper that we wrote using data from the NCCN, which includes 8 academic medical centers that have an outcomes database that you can do patterns of care and outcomes projects in. And we looked at who's getting trastuzumab when they have a breast cancer, and are they completing it, which is a year of therapy which is a big time commitment. And interestingly, in this study, we did not see big differences by race or education for who's starting trastuzumab, but we actually saw differences in who's completing that therapy. So there's something getting in the way of that year, whether it's a commitment, adherence, whether it's toxicity, more heart issues. We did see more cardiac events in patients who did not complete their therapy, but it's a big question mark in why that's happening. And I've mentioned a lot patient adherence. This is a paper by Ann Partridge, who's in our group, which is one of the first papers looking at adherence and the importance of adherence in the breast cancer population. So this was a study that she did looking at patients in New Jersey insured by Medicaid. And this is one of the first studies to highlight the differences we see by race in adherence to tamoxifen, which is a very important therapy in the setting of hormone receptor positive breast cancer that typically goes on for 5 to 10 years. And in this paper, with every increasing year on treatment, the adherence to treatment fell off. And something that I'm very interested in is how knowledge about one's disease may actually contribute to whether somebody gets care. We did a study where we surveyed women in California who are part of the Northern California Cancer Registry and who had had a breast cancer diagnosis in the last few years. And we asked them basic questions about their breast cancer. What's your hormone receptor status? What's your HER2 status? What's your stage? Just to get a sense if people knew about their disease, and then we compared their answers with the tumor registry data. And what we saw was that about 50% of minority patients did not know their cancer stage, their hormone receptor status, or their HER2 status. And this trial got a little bit of attention just because I think it was sort of staggering how little people know about their disease. And this begs the question of, does this matter? I mean, do patients need to know about their cancer to take their treatment or to receive their treatment or to ask for treatment? And we don't know, although some preliminary evidence from this same study where we looked at who got treatment and who didn't by cancer knowledge actually showed higher rates of people taking hormonal therapy if they actually answered that their tumor was hormone receptor positive. And so we don't know the direction of this association, and admittedly this is very possible that people who are taking it tend to know it, but we are further looking into this because I think this is a very interesting thing, and also understanding how treatment rationales and understanding why you're getting a treatment may matter as well. And this is something I know that's near and dear to Dr. Wagley's heart, which is trying to harness social media to try to understand some of this and to talk to patients. And so we conducted this exploratory project, which was a project to search the social landscape. And so we really wanted to look at the internet to see what patients were talking about in a completely unfiltered way without a research project asking them very specific survey questions, which may leave out everything else that they're experiencing. And so what we did was we included over 2,000 websites in this big scouring search, which we used a company called ConsumerSphere to do for us. And we included blogs, topical sites, message boards, social networks to try to understand what women were talking about with regard to barriers and challenges that they were receiving when they had their breast cancer care. And thankfully, in a lot of cases, women actually provide their race, ethnicity, and their user profiles. So for a significant proportion of these conversations, we could tag them to who was talking in a limited way. And so this is just a summary slide where we tried to look at the specific barriers that people were talking about. So again, frank, open, candid, off-the-cuff discussions online. And the major themes that came out were people were talking a lot about resources, their beliefs about medical care and beliefs in general, the emotional aspects of the disease, the relationships that they have, the physical aspects like side effects, healthcare perceptions and process, which really included hospital factors and insurance issues. And here I've put for you the overall. So we were able to tag about 400,000 conversations and categorize them. And we looked at the overall for everybody, and then when race ethnicity could be identified, which was for about 163,000 people, and then we broke down the percentages of kind of what these themes were in tracking. And interestingly, physical barriers, which are shown in the turquoise, were actually a very small part of what people were talking about, which is not what I expected, just because I think when people are going through treatments, they're complaining or feeling like they want to look for somebody that has the same side effect that they do. But actually, there were a lot of sort of non-physical things that people were talking about. And I can try to point this out with the pointer. But in the Black and Hispanic patients, there was much more healthcare perceptions here in the orange, compared to the other groups. And there were also, what was the other one I wanted to point out to you? less of the emotional aspects, which is sort of interesting compared to other subgroups. And so you can see here that there are some, maybe subtle differences, but the conversations may trend a little bit differently. And of course, everybody online is sort of talking with a negative skew. We looked at sort of the skew of conversations, whether they're positive, negative, or neutral, and the majority of conversations online are actually skewed negative, which is not so surprising because people are out there looking for help and talking to other people. And just moving into some of the provider problems, so why patients aren't getting their care and why it's on us. This is a survey of 100 US practices asking about why people may not give standard chemotherapy in the setting of breast cancer. And highlighted in the red box here are the factors that I thought were sort of most relevant to our talk, which is that Black race, educational status, and older age were all related to receiving non-standard, non-guideline care for breast cancer. Hospital factors are also at play for reasons that are very hard to decipher, and this was a paper that Chris Lathan published now several years ago, which looked at the use of lung cancer surgeries in hospitals and the proportion of African Americans treated in that hospital, so the patient mix of that hospital. And what he showed was that hospitals that have the lowest proportions of Black patients have the most surgeries happening, sort of alluding to the fact that that's a driver of care in some form. And so it's hard to talk about all this without at least mentioning, especially to this group who focuses so much on science, some of the differences in tumor biology. And so there have been some additional classification in breast cancer that have come out of gene expression patterns, sort of relabeling some of the subtypes of breast cancer as luminal A and luminal B, triple negative or basal-like, and HER2 type. And I'll talk a little bit more about this on the next slide. But there have been studies now trying to elucidate these different tumor types more defined by genetics and receptors and figuring out what the rates are in different populations. And this was some of the first work looking at this in a diverse patient population. So Lisa Carey published out of the Carolina breast cancer study the genomic results for African American and non-African American patients with breast cancer, and particularly for young patients, premenopausal patients, the luminal A, which are thought to be the lowest risk breast cancer group, hormone receptor positive, low grade cancers, were African Americans were less likely to have that subtype, particularly in the premenopausal state, and basal-like cancers, or the higher risk triple negative cancers, in a very wide definition, were higher in the African American premenopausal population. And so this has also been looked at in a little more detail. Actually, the group at Mass General did exome sequencing and gene expression profiling in about 600 or 700 white women and 100 to 200 Black women as part of the Cancer Genome Atlas project. And they found that African Americans had more TP53 mutations, fewer PIK3CA mutations. They had more intratumor genetic heterogeneity, more basal-like tumors, and also had higher recurrence risk. And in summary, this really showed more aggressive tumor genetics and biology in African American patients compared to other groups. There's also been work that Ann Partridge has recently published with Erica Warner at Mass General, which looked at also NCCN data, which I described to you before, looking at the different subtypes of breast cancer. Interestingly, what came out in this study was that she did 4 models that were trying to look at the hazard rates for death for breast cancer, and in each model she added in different aspects that may affect this. But what came through pretty clearly were that the biggest differences in survival for Blacks versus whites were actually seen in the sort of lower risk tumors rather than the triple negative or HER2 type tumors, begging the question of whether adherence is an issue, whether they're not taking hormonal therapy, or whether there's something else going on that has not been really previously understood. And so moving into opportunities, this is a whole talk in itself and a long list, and there are many not on here, but of course I hope that this discussion will brew many more ideas. But my feeling is that we really need dedicated trials, including tissue and blood banking for subgroups of patients, all different subgroups of patients that include biomarker, biological, and genomics. We really need potentially expansion of trials. So if a trial is really promising, then you expand that trial and get the populations you need and mandate that happens, whether it's older patients or Black patients or whoever you feel like isn't included well in that trial, get expanded data with regard to toxicity and benefit. We also, of course, which has been talked about a lot today, we need better outreach in our community. Can we harness social media? And Nick has done that beautifully with the Metastatic Breast Cancer Project. Can we use big data? So ASCO has launched CancerLink, and they've promoted this as a way for you to see every other hospital's information about a patient like what you're putting in, with the ability to interact all around the country and the world with what's happening in real time and to get real life data in there. There are, of course, educational opportunities. We need to be thinking about the community and community-based trials if we really want to reach all patients. Of course, word of mouth and trying to gain the trust of our patients through however we need to in their community. And of course, better collaboration across sites so that we can pool data, our resources, and come together to address all of this. And I'll briefly touch on a local coalition that's been formed called the Boston Breast Cancer Equity Coalition, which is trying to do some of this on a local level. And we really do need to engage subgroups when designing trials, truly engage, and that's been brought up before. Bring them to the table, have them have the front seat and the front row, hear what they have to say and listen to them. And we really need to be seizing opportunity to fund all of these projects, of course. And I would argue that we are done describing disparities. I'm done. I've done it a lot. I read it a lot. We all know they're there. They exist. Let's do something about it. Let's focus on adherence. Let's focus on individualized care. Let's intervene. And that is really where the future of disparities work needs to go. We are all tired of reading about it. It's awful. We need to do something about it. Thank you. And so as part of that, there is a local effort which was actually spurred by that paper where I showed you that Boston was on the 50 top cities of U.S. cities that are doing poorly with regard to disparities. And so we formed this Boston Breast Cancer Equity Commission, which we're very proud of and is still in its early phases, but we've brought together docs from medical oncology, primary care, radiology, surgery. We have the city and state officials from the Tumor Registry, the Department of Public Health, the Office of Women's Health. We have foundation representatives from BCRF, ACS, Komen. We have administrative leadership from all of the hospitals and clinical researchers, and we come together quarterly to talk about issues in Boston. We have our patients there. We have our pink and black ambassadors who are patients in the city of Boston who are patient advocates. We have our navigators, and we are trying to get funded for various projects we want to do. One main project we're trying to do is to fund a real-time registry in the city of Boston to track patients so that we understand when patients aren't getting care, or if they jump hospitals, and to be able to navigate more patients in the city in a more coordinated way. And of course, the next step from this, I think, will be more and more in the way of genomics and biomarkers and patient experience. And I hope that this coalition continues to grow. And the vision of our coalition is to eliminate the differences in breast cancer care and outcomes by promoting equity and excellence in care among all women of different racial ethnic groups in the city of Boston. And we strive to reach this by identifying, developing, and implementing solutions with the specific goal of eliminating inequities in breast outcomes and care that exist among Black women in Boston. There's another local effort, our Whittier Street Health Center, which I just wanted to mention, where we are trying to partner more with the community. Dana-Farber is very aware that it's a very isolated academic medical center in a lot of ways in our city. This is a federally qualified health center which serves refugees and uninsured patients around the city who speak hundreds of languages. We've had a long-standing relationship with the Whittier Street, and they just built a new building a few years ago which provided the ability to take up space. And so we have our own space in their facility in Roxbury where we practice every other week as a rotating group of oncologists to see undiagnosed or suspected cancer cases, or to pick up care for a patient who's lost to follow-up. And this is a very convoluted map, but basically any patient seen at Whittier whose primary care doctor thinks they need to be evaluated for any reason gets sent to our program nurse, and she sets them up for clinic to see us. We have integrated genetic testing. We have counselors that come over from Dana-Farber every other month to do a genetic counseling clinic there, and we're working hard to try to integrate our care better and to bring patients to Dana-Farber and bring the women's into our system faster, with the goal to decrease the time to diagnostic resolution. And so there are some examples that I think are easier in older patients, and I wish could translate better, but some of you brought up some of these issues of sort of the mistrust issues and trying to target your clinical trials on specific populations. But there have been some great studies dedicated to older patients. This trial in the New England Journal led by Hamas, which was a chemotherapy trial dedicated to older patients, which had embedded functional assessments, biomarkers, quality of life, and was an amazing resource for patients, over 600 enrolled, and we've learned so much from that trial. And Arthi Huria at City of Hope is now leading a prospective trial where any older patient getting chemotherapy for breast cancer is just followed, and they have geriatric assessments which assess their functional status over time. They have rich collection of their adverse events and toxicities, and we're just developing a very rich data source of the experiences of older women getting breast cancer care without an intervention otherwise. And I think that these could be potential models for all of us in thinking about how to target diverse populations where the other clinical trials just aren't doing the job. And so coming back to our points, we all know this is the right thing to do. We need to do this, and we will really never equalize outcomes if we cannot provide access for all at the right time with the right drug to the right patient. And our goal, of course, is to piece it all together so that each patient has their optimal, individualized, evidence-based puzzle connected in a perfect way for that patient, and bringing cancer treatment into that mix with the background of everything else going on in their life in the best way possible. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Rachel, for that really wonderful talk. We have some time for questions and discussion. If folks want to either raise their hand or come to the mic. Yes.
Be gentle.
I worked a number of years ago at South Boston Community Health Center in a primary care practice, and I only recall one conversation that came up with providers at that time about research. And the pediatrician I was working with said, oh, I would never refer anybody to a clinical trial or to research. His view at the time was that this was very predatory. Why would I encourage somebody to participate in research when there are proven treatments? And I just wonder what efforts there are, you work at Whittier, to work with those, changing perceptions of like mid-level providers, nurse practitioners, primary care doctors, so that there's not this misplaced paternalism or protectionism that may be inhibiting people from accessing research.
Thank you so much for that question. It's so hard. I mean, I think there's so many things going on. I think there's so many misconceptions about research out there, even on docs. I mean, I have patients who come in, or I speak to local physicians, referring people in, and they say, oh, well, she still has so many options, so like, why am I going to think about a clinical trial? And that is just the wrong framework, and we all know that. And but there's a lot of misconception about who needs a clinical trial. And again, are you going to lose that patient? Are you going to lose that connection to that patient if you send them somewhere? And I think that the education, as we said earlier, as you said, Professor Hammonds, it has to start early. We all need this in our medical education. I didn't get it. I got it when I was a fellow, and I understand what clinical trials were then. But I can't say that I knew about them in a big way or really understood how they work and the opportunities that they provide until I was in a world like Dana-Farber where I started to understand it. So I think there's so much work to do for education. At Whittier, we do talks. I mean, we rotate, we do talks they have lunch conferences that actually are open to the public. So patients come, mid-levels, the docs will come, there's free food, which always helps. And we talk about all different issues in cancer, and we also used to have provider smaller sessions. So the fact that we're integrated there, I think, has helped a lot. But even in Whittier, there's turnover of staff, and there's differences in how people understand all of this and the differences in how they refer, and it's a huge problem. So there's no easy answer, but I think education and having it early and having sort of experiences from patients be a part of that are huge. So thanks for raising that point.
I have a couple of questions/comments. I'm actually a second-year neuro-oncology fellow at MGH, so rotates through Dana-Farber and Brigham. So I have a couple of questions, one of which with regards to the Whittier Street Health Center. I had not heard of it. So are the patients who you guys see there, are they candidates potentially for clinical trials? And then how do they feed into Dana-Farber or any of the other centers in town from there?
So they're free to go anywhere they want. So if they're already plugged into Boston Medical Center, which a lot of them are, or their provider wants to send them somewhere, they can. Our hope is that we capture most of these patients. So the patients that we see are primarily people who have suspected cancers or lumps and bumps or diagnostic things that need resolution, or they're patients who moved here from Haiti and had cancer 5 years ago and need a provider to follow them and understand what their follow-up care needs to be and to reestablish it. And so we actually, I don't have the numbers with me today, but we have done amazingly well at getting patients at Whittier onto clinical trials. Like our average is like 15 or 20% or something of the patients we've seen get on clinical trials, much higher than the national averages because of our integrated way that we practice. A lot of them are not in the place that they need clinical trials or can have them because they're too far out or they actually don't have cancer. But most of the time what happens is we see them there for their initial consult at Whittier in their home where they're comfortable. And then if they need to come for diagnostic testing, we'll send them over very quickly to the Brigham Dana-Farber. Some patients I follow there once a year at Whittier who are in long-term follow-up who don't need to be seen at Dana-Farber. And I just saw a woman this week who had a phylloides tumor. I see her once a year with her mammogram at Whittier. So it just depends on the patient with what the follow-up is. And we have a nurse navigator who's amazing, who controls all of that and has a huge spreadsheet. So I have complete dependence that she gets everybody in, and she does. Mm-hmm. Everybody who's a patient at Whittier who's a part of our program is invited to be a part of the patient bank. They all get approached by our research coordinator. We try very hard to explain it very well. We have lots of time in that clinic, so we spend a lot of time explaining it. And we invite everybody, whether they have cancer or not, to be a part of our sort of information collection and cohort.
Do they join?
They do join for the most part. I want to say it's like 85% join or something like that, but I don't have the numbers with me. I haven't seen them in a while. Chris Lathan has run that program, and he's a wonderful resource for anyone who wants to hear more about Whittier. He tracks all this stuff for us.
And my second question, actually, because I've met with Dr. Lathan sort of about opportunities for minority investigators. And so do you see that also within sort of thinking about the paradigm of disparities? Do you feel, and I think you alluded to it earlier, in terms of medical education, as a fellow at this huge center, I think I've only encountered two or three other underrepresented minority fellows. So in a large cancer center in this town, I think that's somewhat, disheartening at times. And so, I think sort of in this larger paradigm of disparities and seeking to intervene and mitigate them, where do you see the role of people like me in helping out?
Doing everything you're doing, getting involved because we need you. Yeah. I'm actually a part of a project that's totally separate from this for ASCO, which is the American Society of Clinical Oncology. I'm part of a leadership program there, and our project this year is improving diversity at ASCO. And so we're about to present our information, but we've done a lot of work on this. Only 3 to 4% of all docs in the U.S. are oncologists. So it's not just a local problem. This is a national problem. Minority docs don't go into oncology. They choose other subspecialties. Surgery and cardiology are much more common. So we're already you have a low percentage of minorities in medical schools, and then you just take a small piece of that in oncology, and then you're trying to get every single one everywhere. And so I think we need to start early, and part of our promotion is engaging medical schools more, the right medical schools. There's lots of programs that ASCO has that are not marketed, that are trying to get young people involved, and in fact, there's a lot you could do through ASCO, which I think would be very beneficial to you beyond the walls of Boston and Dana-Farber and Mass General. And so I think that it's getting in there, and I think when you get in there, people start to notice, and they keep asking you to do stuff and be a part of everything. So
thank you.
Thanks for your questions.
Alicia, did you have a question?
Hi, my name's Alicia. I'm actually a 3-time cancer survivor. I've had Hodgkin's and breast cancer. I've actually been a patient at Tufts Medical Center since 1994. And I'm fascinated by this idea that even within the city of Boston, we're very insular about our institutions. So once you're sort of in the Tufts system, you sort of stay in the Tufts system. Once you're in Dana-Farber, you sort of stay in that system as well. And are we sort of creating additional disparities in healthcare by not having better collaboration between some of the really premier cancer institutes here in Boston? Because I feel like there's Okay. Thank you.
Yes. Part of our coalition, this is like the first time we've all come together.
Yeah.
I mean, it's amazing. And everybody's so engaged and so excited, but it's unusual. And Chris Lathan, who treats lung cancer, came to me and said, we got to do this for lung. Why can't we do this for all cancers? And I said, we can, but like you got to probably work it out in each cancer, because to do it across cancers for all, there's just so many things and factors. But I totally agree with you. We need to do so much better at this, and we can. It's a small city. And we can come together better. I think we have in some ways, there are clinical trials that run across centers in the city, but it is still very fragmented.
Because I feel like there's an opportunity for each of these institutions to share learning, in a way that's not competitive. I guess, if one institution or you take an occasion like the MBC project, that something like that should be shared. Or the learning should be shared in a formal way across the city or across these different cancer institutes. And is it up to the advocates to try to push that conversation a little bit more, or
Yeah, it's up to everybody and the leadership. And I think the city leadership is now actually pretty engaged in this topic.
Okay.
And I hope that our commission will become a model for other cancers too. And so yes, advocacy, leadership, the institutions have to have buy-in and have to see the importance of this. And I think most of them do, but you have to find the resources to be able to do it. But I totally agree.
Thank you.
Maybe one last question, Sean.
Yeah, so just,
What's your question? So your question is, how do we get leadership to care?
yeah, it sort of is, how do we stop making diversity sort of a niche issue, you guys, this diversity box, and get people who are sort of looked at as leaders in sort of institutes that are leaders to start speaking out about these large issues to their colleagues who run these studies?
Go to them, go to the leaders. I mean, I think a lot of good leaders do know about this, and they are working on it, and they believe in diversity, and it makes all of us better, and it makes our future better. And I think the degree to which somebody, puts their effort and big resources into it is going to require sort of a lobby from the people around them, probably, or a leader that truly believes in it. I don't have an easy answer to that, but maybe someone else does. I think we have to keep promoting it and showing why it's important. Meet with leaders.
Have you found, I guess just as a follow-up, have you found in your conversations, at least in Boston, the public system, that people are sometimes frustrated to talk about these issues, say race, or, because I can just say from my experience talking about it with people, it's sort of seen as like a black issue, like, oh, that's like a neat issue, but that's a diversity issue, and I do genomics, or I do genetics, or I do science, like that's not.
I think that's true in a way. People say, oh, go talk to Rachel. She cares about this. Or go talk to Chris. And I get that a lot. Like, oh, they told me to come talk to you. Because there are people who are deeply interested in this. But, it's a huge community. So there is a catalyst. I mean, I think there are things going on. But I agree with you. A lot of it is on paper more than in reality. And people want this, but they don't necessarily have the bandwidth to put their time into it if they're involved in 60 other things that are unrelated to diversity. So again, not an easy answer, but I hear you and I agree.
Okay. Well, Rachel, thank you again for a really great talk and great discussion.